Okay. Okay, thanks. Good morning, good afternoon, good day to you all. Welcome to this trade policy preview on Brazil. For those of you who have been following FMG, the Friends of Multilateralism, you know that this is an exercise we do regularly on some members who will be on the normal WTO trade policy review. To give them a kind of candidate out-of-box framework to discuss trade policy developments, but also, as Clem always emphasized, their role in the WTO and they play in the multilateral trading system. And today on Brazil probably is for me, is the most optimal time to host this meeting with the Brazilian presidential election, which just finished last week. I took note that President-elect Lula, in his victory speech, proudly announced that Brazil is back and committing to rejoin the international community. And his top foreign affairs advisor, Minister Celso Amorim, who is no stranger to this community, also indicated that the strengthening of the multilateral system and climate change will be at the heart of Brazil's foreign policy. So for today's exercise, while we probably will look back at in the past few years, the Brazilian trade policy developments, it will also be highly interesting if we could also look forward on the kind of new role of the new Brazilian administration. So with that, I want to thank Clem, our FMG member, who has been leading our trade policy preview initiative, and give him the floor. He will moderate this session. Over to you, Clem. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lou. I don't want to add much to what you've just said, and I'd like to get us started as soon as possible. Last time when we did Mexico, we ran out of time. I'd like to avoid that. Except I do want to emphasize that although we run this somewhat in coordination with the WTO TPR's trade policy reviews, we do not run these trade policy previews in conjunction with the trade policy reviews. We do not have, and I think this is important to note, we do not have access to the WTO papers, the Secretariat paper, the government paper, and I think that's appropriate. That allows us a fresh look at what it is, at the trade policy. With that said, I'm going to give the floor in order to Simon, then to Tatiana, and then to Vera. Simon is going to lead us off. Simon is, as you all know, I think, is a professor at St. Gallen University, but also the founder and in charge of the Global Trade, damn it, Simon, the GTA, that's what I call it. And using the GTA, he's going to give us a presentation on trade policy and his perspective on trade policy in Brazil. Simon, you have about 15 minutes. Off you go.
Thank you, Clem. I'm going to show some slides. These are a subset of a larger slide deck, which I have prepared for this TPR. If anyone would like the larger slide deck, please send me a bilateral chat and I'll get it to you. So let me share some slides and get underway. My goal is, as Clem said, to summarize the trade policy of Brazil as it is now and its evolution since the last TPR. I will begin by putting the TPR in its appropriate socio-economic context. Since the last TPR, which took place in July 2017, GDP per capita in Brazil has stagnated. Real wages have actually fallen. Unemployment was at record highs last year. Having said that, on the positive side, there was a narrowing in the gender wage gap and CO2 emissions have fallen. As far as traditional trade policy is concerned, or trade outcomes are concerned, there was a healthy growth in goods trade, but on services trade, there was some retrenchment. Indeed, there was a 31% fall in the foreign supply of services to the Brazilian market since the last TPR, which is significant. We have had since the last TPR a change of administration, and one is scheduled at the end of this year, as Lou has highlighted. So that is the backdrop for the discussion. The first thing I would like to do is to discuss Brazil's trade policy stance. Rather than show you lots of slides of data, I've summarized the main points, the substantive, the charts with the data in you can get from me. Brazil's tariff regime does indeed have high tariff binding coverage. The average applied rate is about 9%, and there's about 20% of tariff water in the current binding. So there's significant room for increasing tariffs should that be desired. Then we have in our global trade alert database found that for every Brazilian measure that improves the conditions of competition for foreign firms, there are two that have the opposite effect. The principal forms of favoritism towards domestic firms is in the form of corporate subsidies, although other measures are used as well. The favoritism in the Brazilian trade structure is concentrated in just 20 sectors of the Brazilian economy. 75% of all the harmful measures to foreign commercial interests bear upon those sectors. Almost all of them are manufacturing, one or two service sectors that are there as well. There has been a shift since the last TPR from chemicals and motors towards other manufacturers, which we can discern in the data. In terms of the stance as of the beginning of October, on the left-hand side, we can see the distribution of measures taken which worsen the treatment of foreign commercial interests. As I argued earlier, this is dominated by subsidies, but tariff increases are important. On the right-hand side, we see far fewer measures that are in force at the moment, which benefit foreign firms, and they are principally temporary tariff reductions. Turning now to the developments since the last TPR, and we have the following. Since the last TPR, approximately 46% of Brazilian imports are in products where there has been measures that favor local firms. So that is a significant percentage. It is actually exceeded by the share of Brazilian imports which are in HS codes where there has been some liberalization. And by 2021, 54% of Brazilian imports were covered by measures which were not present at the last TPR and were in effect last year. There is a large jump this year, which you'll see in one chart, which reflects a measure taken in May. And that is, again, another temporary tariff reduction. As we noted earlier with the current trade policy stance, we can see in the import coverage data, most of the gains to foreign commercial interests are in the form of temporary import tariff cuts, which are renewed typically every 6 or 18 months. And on the other side of the ledger, we see that tariff increases account for 35% of the harm done to foreign commercial interests, and 21% is due to new corporate subsidies. This gives you a sense then of the significant amount of commerce which has been affected since the last TPR. In terms of exposure to those harmful measures by Brazil, we can see big differences across developing countries, as I'll show you. The LDC countries appear to come away unscathed, but other groups of developing countries do not. There's no suggestion here that Brazil is targeting different groups of developing countries. It seems that the incidence of the products exported by those developing countries has a big impact on what share of their exports to Brazil has suffered since the last TPR. We have, and I will also show you some data on which economies have seen more than $1 billion of their market access compromised since the last TPR. So this chart here shows you in red, which is the growth of the share of Brazilian imports that face different types of trade distortions implemented since the last TPR. Down at the bottom, you can see in brown the LDC export share, which faces problems in the Brazilian market, is essentially flat at 0, whereas other groups of developing countries are less lucky. In particular, the ACP group appears to export goods to Brazil, where Brazil has been favoring local firms systematically. We see when it comes to which countries face market access risks in Brazil since the last TPR, there are 17 nations where more than $1 billion of their exports are at risk. Several of them are on this call. Many of those countries are G20 members, but not all of them are. There's no suggestion here that Brazil is targeting these countries. It's more that this is the fallout from measures that Brazil has taken. And you can see that the USA, China, and Argentina are quite seriously at risk here of market access erosion. So we can see that there's an uneven incidence in the Brazilian measures taken since the last TPR. What is Brazil's stake in the open world trading system? Well, if we use our database to track where there have been changes in foreign market access, we can see that 20% of Brazil's exporters are exporting goods to markets where there has been trade reform. And this is the good news for Brazil. The bad news is that 2/3 of their export face more difficult conditions of competition abroad, and this is largely on account of the extremely high use of subsidies in recent years. When it comes to which trading partners have taken steps to harm Brazil's interests the most, we have a list of countries, about 14 of them have taken measures where the market access that Brazil is facing could be eroded by more than $1 billion. And you can see that they are principally G20 members. So Brazil has a stake in the system in trying to turn around and remedy these measures which have been taken, which harm its interests, as well as trying to take advantage of those export opportunities as well. Let me conclude. I'm going to have 2 more slides. Here is one slide looking forward. I thought it might be useful, since we're about to have a change in administration in Brazil from one party to another party, to compare the trade policy stance of the Bolsonaro regime with the 4 years preceding it, which of course is the party of President Lula. We can see on the left-hand side here, if you're looking at harmful measures, that is harmful to foreign commercial interests, the policy stance did change between Bolsonaro and his predecessor. There were 30% more harmful measures taken during the Bolsonaro era, and the policy mix was heavily dominated by subsidies and tariff changes, and the share of tariff increases has risen compared to the predecessor administration. As far as trade reforms are concerned, again, more action under Bolsonaro, but the policy mix appears to be similar to the 4 years preceding it. So if anything, the policy mix shifted on the harmful measure side. On the right-hand side of this chart is something which rather surprised me. I traced out over the 4 years of the Bolsonaro administration and the 4 years before what was the share of Brazilian imports which were benefiting from liberalization by Brazil or by harmful measures taken. And there's a very interesting pattern. If you look at the red lines, you can see that the share of imports which has been covered by harmful measures taken by Brazil was less under Bolsonaro than under the previous regime. And if you look at the green lines, you see the solid green line. In every year, the Bolsonaro regime opened up markets more, or to a greater degree, than the predecessor regime. So if we are going to switch from red to green in the next 4 years, then there's a clear prediction if the second Lula administration is anything like the 4 years that came before Mr. Bolsonaro. So this data may help inform the discussion of where things might go next. I conclude with 5 short questions. First, we see that market access improvements, have for quite a long period of time been exceeded by the scale of restrictive measures. That's flipped around in the last year, but before this last year, one has to ask what development purpose was served by having so much of Brazil's imports being restricted or covered by restrictive measures. Secondly, Brazil uses or resorts to temporary tariff reductions on a regular basis. What is the development value of such temporary tariff reductions, and could the duration of them be extended? Third, what role, if at all, do trade-related consequences play when Brazil awards subsidies to local firms? What trade considerations are taken into account? What could be taken into account? Fourth, Given Brazil is itself exposed to lots of foreign subsidies, how could it join forces with other countries to be able to tackle this matter at the global level? And lastly, given the information I've just shown you, if history is anything to go by, what can we expect from a second Lula administration? That concludes my briefing. Back to you, Clem.
Simon, that was marvelously comprehensive, yet concise. Thank you very much. I'm going to go, without any further ado, I'm going to go to Tatiana. Tatiana is Director of the Department of Trade and Foreign Affairs at the Federation of Industries in Sao Paulo. She was also previously in Director General Acevedo's office as a senior advisor. And prior to that, she had been the Secretary of Foreign Trade in Brazil. That's an impressive record, Tatiana. I look forward to hearing your views on Brazil's trade policies over the last couple of years, but also Simon's last question. How are things, do you think, how are they going to change? Are they going to change? Tatiana, take as long as you like, actually. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I intend to be brief, but I'd like to start by expressing my appreciation for being here, for engaging with you all, and to congratulate Simon for the brilliant work on Brazil, on reviewing Brazil's trade policies. I've learned a lot from you, actually, even if I'm of course, my daily activities are related to trade policy, trade in general, but your approach is very enlightening. So thank you for that. Well, there's a lot to comment on. I have some points here that I wanted to, to focus on. First of all, I have this sense that we talk about major changes in geopolitical kind of dynamics and major shifts in the world, et cetera, and we see what's happening in the US, in the EU, in China, including in terms of industrial policy, but in defining strategic sectors, et cetera. And then we turn the page and talk about trade policy as if things were not connected, but in fact they are. I was, and thanks Clem for mentioning that, but I was Brazil's foreign trade secretary in one of the PT's administration from 2011 to 2013. And I remember that Brazil's trade industrial policy was challenged in the WTO dispute settlement system. And I don't want to get into the economic value of Brazil's industrial policy at that point in time, but frankly, when we look at what's happening in China, in the EU, in the US, what Brazil was planning to do back then really fades in comparison in terms of the amount of subsidies and government incentives that are being channeled in major economies for the promotion of its strategic sectors. And when we see these tensions at the global level, I mean, I wonder if we can keep talking about trade policy in the same way as before, if we want to keep disputing who's the best in class in terms of who follows the world has been changing, and we keep repeating that, but we keep looking at trade policy via the same policy approach that we used to in the past. And there's a lot of frustration, I tell you, in Brazil regarding the rules, the multilateral trading system. Of course, that is not only in Brazil, but Brazil was one of the countries that, at some point had one of its major policies challenged in the dispute settlement system and had to adapt, change, etc., to follow the rules, just to see a few years later, well, countries that have deeper pockets than Brazil spending a lot more in strategic sectors. Everything's about national security. Everything can be justified under sustainability, and we'll get to that. Of course, that is hugely important. But the way trade policies, trade instruments have been weaponized for other policy objectives is something that I think is in the back of many people's minds in Brazil when we think about trade rules and the WTO. Having said that, I noted, Simon, that it was at 46% of Brazilian imports affected by restrictive trade measures. And it's interesting to look at that because the sentiment in Brazil is that this and that goes that coincides with what you were with your last slide, Simon. The sentiment here is that there has been an opening of the Brazilian market, including by these two tariff reductions, 10%, a horizontal tariff reduction of 10%, applied tariffs 10%, and then 10% again. The Brazilian industrial sector complains about the lack of predictability related to that. That was implemented without much notice. And the industrial sector also regrets the fact that the lack of predictability creates problems in terms of business planning, etc. You mentioned, Simon, I think it's a very good point. The temporary nature of many of those measures creates some problems in terms of, thinking ahead. But when we mentioned 46% of imports affected by restrictive trade measures, the sentiment in the country is not that Brazil has become more restrictive in terms of trade. To the opposite, I think that's how we feel it here. And in some areas, I will mention trade remedies here. The sentiment from the private sector is that it has gone far beyond what it should. There was a point in time where Brazil was the first in terms of opening of new investigations, was the first in terms of application of new measures, etc. And then the view of the current administration was that, that had to change. And then what we saw, and that is particularly true for the instrument of public interest, right? So Brazil has been using public interest to suspend the application of trade remedies in Brazil in a way that the private sector deems inappropriate. So from 2017 to 2021, Brazil has suspended 23 trade remedy measures in force on the grounds of public interest. By contrast, Canada, the EU, or New Zealand have suspended 0. So the instrument of public interest has been widely used in Brazil to suspend trade remedy measures. Just one example, I mentioned predictability. This is something that the private sector would like to see changes. And then in trade remedies, we believe that there is room for improvement in the Brazilian system as well. But by and large, the sentiment in the country is not that Brazil has moved in the direction of closing its borders, of adopting more trade restrictive measures than before. The sentiment here is actually that the world is changing, that the markets that we export to are adopting more and more. There's more state intervention in other markets in ways that affect our exports. So we can talk about sustainability and how the Brazilian government and Brazilian private sector, is deeply concerned with the EU due diligence measures related to deforestation, how the private sector believes this is arbitrary. And though my EU colleagues like to mention that this is autonomous measures, we believe that it's unilateral and discriminatory. Also, we see subsidies being provided in a very generous manner in various markets, and Brazil not having the kind of pockets that other countries. I think the impact here is that there's a lot of concern. So I will stop here, just comment a little bit on the future, on how I personally see the future on a very personal basis. But the picture today is a little bit different, I think, than the one that we get from the numbers. The sentiment is that there has been an opening, there's less predictability, there's less dialogue with the private sector, but this is something for us to discuss internally. But what we see is that the markets that we export to are providing more incentives, are adopting more measures on the name of other policy objectives, including national security and sustainability. And it's been an environment that is increasingly challenging for Brazilian exports and for Brazilian products to compete abroad. Very briefly on the future, of course, it's a pure speculation on my side. But I do believe that, of course, sustainability will rank very high in terms of Brazil's priorities, and Brazil will endeavor, that's my feeling again, to tackle deforestation in the country, and in the same time, we try to reposition itself as an agro-environmental power. And I think in that sense, just echoing what's been said, I think there will be an effort for Brazil to be back in that sense, as a major voice in that area, as it was at one point in time. Development will be back on the agenda. I think we saw in the recent past Brazil adopting a different position in terms of SDT, in terms of development in general in the WTO. That may change. I don't know. I think some negotiations, including GPA, may be impacted by that. This is something to note as well. But again, it's just me speculating. And I think some points remain open, how the new government would see tariff administration, these tariff reductions that we saw in the recent past, how we will relate with, South-South cooperation, maybe regaining currency. Mercosur again, the region, South America, but Mercosur again, how we will see. There's been some speculation on whether Brazil would like to reopen the EU-Mercosur agreement. There's this frustration, and I can tell that very clearly from the private sector. There's this frustration that you negotiated a free trade agreement where you commit to eliminate your tariffs, and then on the expectation that you have market access on the other side. But then you have these autonomous measures, and then where's the market access that I was expecting to get? And that may be back on the agenda. And another open question is what will happen with the OECD accession process. Brazil, the current government was moving ahead in its efforts for Brazil to join the OECD. It's unclear whether the new government would also take the same approach. So I'll stop here just with this broad comment on the current picture, and opening and just going a bit further on Simon's comments on the future, right? I think we will see some changes in terms of Brazil's foreign policy affecting trade policy, environmental policy, and how Brazil sees itself in the world with regards to the developing world. Thank you.
Tatiana, thank you. Thank you very much indeed. You mentioned predictability as being an issue in trade policy in Brazil. On a related matter, how transparent are Brazil's trade policies? And Simon has done some work on that. Perhaps you can think about or comment on that as well at some stage, Simon. Another point, and neither Simon nor you, Tatiana, have mentioned this, perhaps Vera will. At one point, there was a great deal of concern in Brazil, I think there was a great deal of concern in Brazil, about exchange rate manipulation by trading partners. To what extent is that still a concern in Brazil? And there is one major trading partner in particular that you were thinking about at the time. And perhaps you might think about that and come back to it at some point. And one final point, development is back on the agenda, Tatiana, you said. Is development back on the agenda an implicit statement that you're going to become, that Brazil is going to become somewhat more protectionist? Is Simon's, is that, these are just open questions I have at the present moment. Vera, I hear you laughing in the background, and I'm not going to go to Simon or Tatiana with my questions. I'm going to go to you, and again, you have 10, 15 minutes if you wish. It's you, Vera. And let me actually introduce you. I've not done that. You're a professor at the FGV School of Economics in Sao Paulo. But as important from some perspective, you're also the WTO Chair in Brazil, and you have been since 2014. You're continuing in that sense with something that we have done with previous trade policy previews, giving the floor to the WTO Chair in the country, if there is one, And so that using your outreach mandate, you actually can, perhaps having spoken to academics, having spoken to business, having spoken to the policymakers in Brazil, give us a broader view of the Brazilian trade policy. If you have a possibility, Vera, tell us a little bit, using your outreach, about how the private sector thinks about this. Tatiana's already mentioned lack of predictability. How do they do? The floor is yours.
First of all, it's a pleasure to be here and to see very nice and old faces and friendly faces. Now, Tatiana is a diplomatic lady, very nice, but I'm not a nice lady, and I'm going to be very direct, right? And I'm a full academic person. I have nothing to do with the government anymore. I have nothing to do with private sector, with industry, and so on. What I'm speaking is an academic person. First of all, Simon, I love your work. I love you, but I do not agree when you put bananas and tomatoes all together. Look, if you put together tariffs and anti-dumping and so on, come on, tariff is a legal instrument, anti-dumping is a legal instrument, and so be careful. I do not like the way you put the numbers together. First, if I agree with you what you show us empty glass. And now what I can tell you as a person I'm a trade analyst, that come on, in the last 6 years, Brazil opened its trade, its policy in the way that we are not going to see in the future. Point one. So, and you lose all this kind of this argument when you show your numbers, right? Look, being a street academic, yes. Look, go to the models. I'm not talking about ideology. I'm talking about models. In Brazil, in the last years, even the tenured government, we tried to use to be in the model of neoliberalism. Now, certainly for the person who speak for the new government, you are going to see more neo-development model. It's done. That's the point. So what we had in the last period, it's true that it's a lot of law, and you skip all of them, all of attempts to open the economy in the sense of less bureaucracy, much more liberal-oriented, in the sense that, come on, the state-owned enterprise, it's a huge effort to put them down, but you have a problem, the legal issues that, and I'm not going to say that this, the selling of the SCOAs is going to continue, probably not. So if you go to tariffs, yes, the Brazil attempt to cut tariffs 10% and another 10%, and diminish the tariff because of COVID and so on. Do you know what's happened? There's a huge pressure from the industry against it, and let us tell you the truth. There's a huge pressure from Argentina against it. So to Brazil to diminish its tariffs, it has to fight with Argentina and the industrial people. That's the point. So let's see. And then we are going to, I'm reading the papers that Latin America be an important issue to be discussed. So again, let's see how the new government is going to understand Mercosur as it is. Because, come on, you know that Argentina and Brazil are not on the same wave. They are all against one of the other. So, look, you miss all the regulation reform of Brazil. You miss the attempts of, and not explain why you cut the tariffs, but we not get much more results on it. And again on the agreements, again, we try. And I agree with Tatiana that there's a big difficulty to negotiate new agreements. The government attempt to start 10 new negotiations against the pressure of the sector, and even against. I'm looking for a friend for Uruguay here, but where is Guillermo? Come on, it's impossible to negotiate. Argentina is against negotiating a new agreement. So there's the point. That's what kind of policy Brazil is going to choose, Mercosur or Brazil alone. So that's the point. So new agreements, and I fully agree with Tatiana, there is a huge concern now that the space that the European Union concedes to Brazil in terms of commodities and agriculture and so on was not balanced with industry gains. And this is clear in the speech of the new president, Lula, when he talked with the press, international press. There's a huge concern in the goods that I fully agree that will be a revolution on the climate and environment policy in Brazil. And this is clear on the point, and this is really important. But this is the other side. And Simon, a good question for you. I discovered in the environment database in WTO a marvelous work that WTO is doing. 14,000. Look, Simon, 14,000 environment and trade and environment related. I wanted to see how you are going to measure this, because the United States, the community, they have more than 2,000 each one, and Brazil has a little bit. So the question is how you are going to merge environment issues in your glorious, famous database. Right? And okay, let me be friend again. Come on, I put all my revolt on the empty glass of Simon. There was you can see it at a half plenty glass, not empty. Now, if you ask me about the future, well, the economic model has changed. Full stop. What the attempt of the old government to liberalize with some success, more than you show, Evenett, really, more than you show. Because of the model you choose to measure them. And the new government. It's clear that tariff will stay there. I fully agree with you. It's the number are 10% average peaks and so on, but I don't, because of the pressure of the private sector. You missed all the reforms in the monetary system, the financial system, within the independence of the central bank, all the measure of risk of the central bank, environment and risk-related issue. That we have a lot of the famous PIX, that is that you can use your phone to ask for money and pay everything. There are some good things that were made, right? That you missed to point on, because you mix everything together, right? And look, if you see the number of trades, come on, almost 40%. Brazil all the time, all my life, spent 24% of GDP percentage, and now it's 40%. Come on, Simon, it's a huge. What Brazil import in the last 6 years is a huge amount, and this the protectionism, that is the new protectionism of the world, is going to impede on this. Look, what else? GDP, I said around a lot of the regulatory issue, and I want to say one thing, and this for all the friends of multilateralism. I'm being studied and deeply involved with the OECD session of Brazil. Professor Van der Bosch, I said this already. What is going on is terrible for us. OECD, when they invite a country to accede, the revolution that you have to do is much more important than WTO, what WTO is doing. As I said before, OECD is eating the regulatory space of WTO. Come on. The form of tariff is there. the regulatory policy. Simon, what is regulatory barriers? This is what the OECD is measuring. And I'm deeply involved of the indicators. And I can tell you, Brazil improved the indicator of service, improved the indicators of a lot of macroeconomic data, and you miss everything, right? The restrictiveness of investment, so important for us. It is in the WTO. I'm studying indicators, and not what you said. So things are not so clear as you show now. On the future, as I said, things are going to change, and I guess that things are not going to change for the liberal side. It's going to be much more, because the world is much more protectionist than what we think the WTO wants to do, right? So that's the point. I finished, and I wait for your question. Simon, just to say, I love your work, but you have to separate bananas and tomatoes. Not good to put them together. I told you that 20 years ago, and I'm still saying this. Look, you show us a different Brazil. I'm not recognize my country that I'm studying every day. I'm not recognize my country in your numbers. That's it. I love you.
Are you talking to me now?
Yes, Clemens, you know that I love you. Sorry, for the ones that never met me, I am like this. Sorry.
Well, Vera, thank you very much. You've been forthright, shall we say? Simon, do you want a few moments?
Sure, because I'm not sure that there's much disagreement between Vera and I, despite her lightning.
That's what I thought. And I want you to actually say that.
Because I think slide 11 of mine showed that during the Bolsonaro era, the amount of imports, or the share of Brazilian imports which were exposed to reforms, far exceeded those which were exposed to measures that favor local firms. And that flips from the previous 4 years. So the idea that, that if we go back to the Workers' Party, it's likely to have a more restrictive policy mix is exactly what we showed in the data. Okay, so that I think is the first point. The second point is to say that this environmental database that the WTO has, which is a step forward, it's true it has 14,000 measures in them, but 5,000 to 6,000 of them are SPS and TBT measures. And we've always avoided putting those into our database because we don't want people telling us that we're conflating protectionism and liberalization with public regulations. So that's a design choice, which one can debate. And lastly, the OECD work on services is indeed very valuable. But again, it shows moves in the reforming direction, which is exactly what we were showing on the trade policy stance side too. So I see that as consistent. So I'm afraid I don't quite see the chasm of difference between Vera's position and what the data shows. In fact, I think the data shows precisely what Vera was trying to characterize as her understanding of the evolution of the Brazilian economy. Thanks, Glenn.
Let me say one point. A disclaimer. Look, I am not defending the Bolsonaro government here. I am an academic, right? And to tell the truth, I can confess what I vote. I nullify my vote. That's it. That's the point. I am being an academic person here. I do not agree what the two options I had. That's it.
Thank you, Vera. I'm going to move on. I'm going to move on a bit. There is one question that came up in the chat, and that's from France. I can't see the delegate here, but about the trade and civil aircraft agreement, whether that will be impacted. Would you care to repeat that?
No, GDP. No. What I said.
No, Vera. No, Vera. Hold it for a moment. There is a question that came through the chat. Lou, you actually identified it.
Yeah, he's our friend from French delegation who
That's
just
what I
asked.
too.
Yeah, who asked whether there will be any change with the new administration, Brazilian administration, would there be any change in the negotiations of the civil aircraft agreement? Yeah.
My
It's
view
a rather
is that
particular
would-
question, but I'm not quite sure who to direct this to. It's either Vera or Tatiana at the present moment.
My
Right.
sense is that would not change. That's my guess. That would not change. I see Victor nodding. Let me say that Victor, with Ambassador Graça Lima, they've published a brilliant paper on Brazil trade policy. And if we have the chance to hear from Victor, that would be fantastic as well. That paper is really excellent. As I mentioned, a plurilateral agreement. Let me say that I think Brazil's views on plurilaterals in the WTO, open plurilaterals, would not change as well. So it's not that Brazil would take a different stance on that. A very important, I think, issue for the future of the system.
Thank you, Tatiana. And indeed, I wanted to go next to Victor, particularly given the paper that he's just written, but for his views on Brazil's trade policy. Victor, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Clem. I see Hamid and Lou had raised their hands. I don't know whether you want to give the floor to Hamid or to
No,
Lou.
no, I'd like to go to you first, and then.
Okay. Well, thanks, and I'm really thrilled to participate in this discussion and to see again so many friends, and especially Tatiana and Vera, with whom we have been discussing trade policy. Tatiana just recently organized a brilliant discussion in the Federation of Industries in Brazil. It was a closed meeting about the OECD accession of Brazil. Vera was in the panel, and we really had a very, very thorough discussion about this issue, which sort of will say a lot about the future of Brazil. But let me start by saying, I see Vera a bit defensive on what Brazil is doing in terms of trade policy. Let me say this, and I know my Brazilian friends may not like this. By any measure of comparison, Brazil continues to be a rather closed economy with high tariffs and with a degree of protection that is not comparable to other developed countries. Now, there are issues and there are explanations for this. And something that has not been mentioned here is the homework that Brazil still has to do on the so-called Brazil cost. This is a term that is used very often in Brazil, and it relates to issues of a Byzantine complexity of Brazil's fiscal system. It relates to problems in Brazil's infrastructure that in a way hamper Brazil's competitiveness and productivity. So this homework is still to be done. And I know that many in Brazil, in the productive sector, feel that as long as this homework is not done, and they blame basically the government for this, that it would be difficult for Brazil to open more than what it is open. I personally hold a different view. I think these things can be done together, that you can tackle the so-called Brazil cost and use opening up your trade together, and that the OECD accession could help precisely with that. So this is my personal view. Now, I know this is going to be a tough call because of some of the issues that Tatiana mentioned. When the EU introduces due diligence in deforestation, carbon border adjustment measures, this is not going to be helpful for you to convince people in Brazil that the country needs to open up. And this is a tough discussion. Even if, in a way, I think what we're going to see, and I don't want to prolong this too much, what I think we're going to see is a rather progressive government in terms of social, environmental issues. And this tallies with, Brazil coming back to the fore in world diplomacy on these issues. Brazil has traditionally been very active in environmental, social issues, etc. But you might see a not so progressive country in terms of opening up trade, as was the case during the Bolsonaro government. And I think Simon's presentation brilliantly shows this. There has been some opening up there during the Bolsonaro government. I still think that Brazil doesn't use trade policy in a way that clearly points to what the objectives are. What are you trying to achieve with one measure or the other? It's not always clear. So this is something that we need to think about. Finally, on the report, and thank you, Tatiana, for mentioning the SEBRI report. Graça Lima and myself make recommendations about future relations with US, EU, China, etc., and also about the OECD and Mercosur. And I also agree, Mercosur is going to be back on the agenda, but that to me is a less clear proposition. What is going to happen with Mercosur and Brazil's position to it beyond the political speech? Thanks, Clem.
Victor, thank you very much. Did I hear you correctly when you said Brazil compared to other developed countries?
Well, yes, because if you look at the tariff composition,
yeah,
because if you look at the I don't want to compare Brazil with India in here, because then the tariff mapping is completely different, right? But I think you should compare Brazil with developed and even with some developing countries. I'm looking at Fernando here.
Okay, how then does Brazil?
Or Chile, or even Peru. I'm looking at Mercedes.
So Chile, Costa Rica. Does that mean that Brazil's attitude towards S&D is going to evolve?
Well, Tatiana said it, and I agree with her. It's going to be a tough call, because what does S&D mean? So issues like S&D, issues like intellectual property, you might have a different discourse now. What does this mean in practice remains to be seen.
I asked Victor because it's a burning question in the WTO at the present moment. And will Brazil be ready to take a position on this matter, encouraging the members to move forward on it? With your own with Brazil's own change in position, perhaps.
I think surely a nuance in position, and sorry to come back to this, but then, you know, there are other pressures there in Brazil. Look at the Brazil-India dispute on sugar. There's a lot of frustration in there with what has happened. Brazil won the case, and nothing happens. So it's not as, you know, you're not going to see that same type of complete alignment with BRICS and that sort of thing. Okay. Brazil, for all the good or the bad, is a more complex country than others. Thanks.
Mercedes, before I go to Hamida and Lou, I see you nodding in agreement with Victor. Would you like to say a few words?
Yeah, what Vera has said is very important, because there is a movement here in Latin America of going to the other side of the story, again, protectionism, again, probably not willing to go further with the ideas of more liberalization. So that's very dangerous. And we were saying that for a long time, be careful, don't put too much pressure to these countries. And what Victor said, I mean, this issue of due diligence in Europe is a black box. I mean, we don't know exactly what kind of things can you ask. Countries are in the process of adjusting to development, like Peru. We were very open. We have very open markets. Our tariffs are around 2%. But what are you asking us as exporters, for example, in the fruit and vegetables side? We are very open, but that would be like excluding many other possibilities, because only big firms can probably accomplish with this due diligence, but the small firms. So what are we gonna do with that, or small farmers? And that's very dangerous. I mean, in the region, protectionism could rise again. Here we're talking again of a new agricultural reform, what that means, they're talking about protectionism again, and safeguards and anti-dumping and all the issues that we have as an instrument by using it not in the right way. So we have to be very careful, and really I miss the time in which we could be able to talk more openly about what is going on in our region. And Fernando knows that, because also Mexico is happening something in the same direction. It's like weird, and that's very interesting point I was put there, the OECD. We are also invited to be part of the OECD. So this process of better policies is very important. I mean, for having a better government. But we are not looking at that, because protectionism is not the right answer, I think, from the European Union, for example. I think, why don't you focus on the issues of how this government can reduce the cost of Brazil, cost of Peru, cost of Argentina, which is important to see. And that's the red tape that we have that is very big, and bad policies, bad regulation. We have to improve that, definitely. And that probably will reduce the risk of having more this kind of trade war again, Thank you.
Thank you, Mercedes, and I agree. Protectionism is not the right answer. Hamid, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Clem, and thank you all for wonderful presentations. Tatiana, Vera, Simon, and finally Victor. Excellent perspectives. First, before I come to my question, let me make a quick comment in recognition of the positive direction of the development of Brazil's perception of the system and what needs to be done in the system. I think Brazil's attitude towards the system has been evolving in this positive direction, where it takes complete recognition of the diversity among developing countries in particular, and that reflects on Brazil's position on things like plurilaterals or special and differential treatment. Now, it is a realization, actually, an understanding of the global trade landscape and how it's shifting. Now, I come to my question, and sorry here to be sort of boringly predictable about what I'm going to ask about. The services sector represents 70% of Brazil's GDP, 63% of Brazil's GDP, and employs 70% of the labor force. If any of the speakers could shed some light about the directions in which services trade policy is going, with respect to the key sectors, the backbone of the economy, whether it's telecoms, tourism, distribution, financial services, logistics, and so forth, and also the trends that may be sort of pulled out, the common threads of the regulatory changes that are taking place, because obviously it affects a critical part of the economy, not just digital trade, but everything else that feeds into the production of other goods. So any insights on the trends on services trade policy would be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Hamid. Before I give the floor back to the panelists, let me go to Lou. You have your hand up, Lou.
Yeah, thanks, Clem. I enjoyed very much listening to everyone. It's probably one of the most dynamic, lively discussion of trade policy preview exercise, and with all the speakers, and also what Victor has done. It's more or less for me like a kind of samba dance, very lively. My question is very much actually, Clem, related to what you have done, discussed with Victor, and also what I have been reading after this presidential election. Is about the leadership role of Brazil vis-a-vis developing countries. Yeah. Because I also am personally connected to this, because I started my WTO career shortly after, around China's accession to the WTO. So to be frank with you, at that moment, Brazil was the very leader of developing countries. And I would have been learning a lot from my Brazilian colleagues on different negotiation subjects and the way organize things and everything. So that's really great fun for me. But of course, we know that with the change of the government, there was a substantial change of the policy of Brazilian government on development policy, and Brazil also let go its right for future negotiations of special and differential treatment, and on some negotiated subjects, Brazil has alienated itself from other developed countries. So there was a lot of debate on that. Some newspaper from Brazilian journalists say that probably Lula and Amorim are going to bring Brazil back to that stage, a kind of re-establish Brazil as a leader of developed countries or with other emerging economies. I just want to listen to our Brazilian friends on this point of view and how that would change the policy. I know it's a hard question, but on special and differential treatment, developed country status, and how Brazil would work with other developed countries, especially emerging economies. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it is a hard question, Lou, but it may be, it's, I think, a rather important one in the context of the WTO at the moment. Peter, you raised an interesting point about Brazilian cost, raised a question. Do you want to say a few words on that? And then I'll go back to the panelists, but let's...
Thank you, Clem. It was just, I don't really have much more to say than I wrote in the chat. There's talk about Brazil costs, but as this was a new concept to me, so I thank you for introducing me to that concept. But it seems, as the cost was explained by Victor, it seems to be a cost that many countries have, and yet they do not, or at least did not, invoke it as a justification for trade restrictive measures. So I don't think it's a particularly Brazilian thing, that cost. But perhaps I'm wrong. Perhaps there's something that makes it particularly Brazilian.
Victor, do you want to comment on that? Or Mercedes, because you mentioned that.
No, I think the best one to comment on this is Tatiana, and because she knows this, she knows this very, very well, having held the position of Secretary of External Foreign Trade, and the pressures that the private sector puts on the government there. Sorry to push the ball to you, Tatiana. I could say that, but you're really well fit for that.
Okay. Actually, I do agree. But before I go to Tatiana now, I want to, and before I go back to the panelists, I'd like to give a brief word to Helio from the Brazil delegation. Say something nice, Helio.
Okay. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, I have to be disciplined here and just participate as a listener. But of course, thank you very much on behalf of my ambassador, Alexandre Parola, for organizing this event. I see on the list of participants many friends and also legends of the multilateralism. It's really an honor to share this event with you. And I thank, first Simon for his presentation. I really appreciate the work that GTA does. I mean, it really fills a gap, especially in data collection. I'm a big fan of the work that the GTA did on subsidies, for instance. I think that there's a lot of data that GTA is providing us and very helpful for trade policy, and really fills a gap that even WTO or other international organizations cannot completely fill. So I thank Simon for his presentation, very interesting. And also Tatiana and Vera. I think they both brought the domestic perspective. So in this sense, they complement what has been presented by Simon. But apart from that, I cannot make any further comments. And just to thank you all for organizing this. And but officially, we cannot make any statements before the TPR review itself. But I'm sure that we'll have other occasions to discuss it. And I just thank you very much for this event.
Helio, thank you very much. And those were nice words. I'm going to go back to the panelists. I'm not quite sure in which order, but Victor more or less directed me to Tatiana And Tatiana, could you start off perhaps with the Brazilian cost point, but also with the other questions that have been raised?
Sure.
And if you
No,
okay, no, please go ahead. I was about to interrupt you. I was being very French. Sorry.
please go ahead.
No, go ahead, please. It's yours.
Oh, thank you. As I listen to the comments, it reminds me of a sentiment that we have here, that Brazil very often is late to the party. Brazil very often is late to the party. So there was a moment in time where Brazil was implementing import substitution policies, looking at trying to develop its own industry by, frankly, sealing off its economy from external competition, etc. And then, of course, the world was in a different kind of conversation. And then, there's a government now that is very proud of its liberal speech, its narrative. Now we want to. But the world's moved on again. And that's something that we must say. Now Brazil wants to be part of GPA. Great. Well, listen. Pay attention to what's happening in terms of government procurement in other countries. Moved on. There was a moment in time where the US was very interested in a free trade agreement with the Americas, FTAA. Well, Brazil was interested in something else. Now that, maybe Brazil wants to, how many agreements they wanted to negotiate at the same time, Vera? You mentioned very many. And then, no, maybe the US is not interested anymore in negotiating free trade agreements and reducing tariffs. And even the OECD, frankly, there was a moment where there was a clear understanding that the OECD represented, a movement in the right direction. But now with geopolitical tensions increasing, there's this perception in some in Brazil that, if the world is getting more complicated, Brazil aligning itself with the OECD may come at a cost with other players, or maybe not. Maybe Brazil will be skillful, able enough to work with the BRICS and the OECD at the same time, and things will be fine. But what I find interesting, in collecting my thoughts as I listen to you, is that Victor put it very nicely. The new government in Brazil may be more progressive in social terms and economic terms. But then in trade policy terms, it may be a bit different. And I hear it not from him, but from others, development in developing countries, this conversation about development means protectionism. And then this conversation about weaponizing trade policy for national security interests or weaponizing trade policy for environmental concerns, that's strategic. If developed countries do, and I don't like this developed countries, but I feel like I must say something. Whenever I hear, this will be a more development-oriented trade policy, that's protectionist. And I feel like that's not quite right. When I see developed countries implementing some policies in the name of national security or environment and so on and so forth, that's strategic. People, we hear self-sufficiency all the time, and not from Brazil, from the others. I feel like we're late to that party again. We have a government who talk about, we're very liberal, we want to open up, etc., etc. But look around. I think this will be different. And talking about development should not be seen as protectionist. But just to quote one number here, trade remedies, right? So we talk a lot about trade remedies, that's protectionist, etc. So trade remedies in Brazil, they accounted for 1.09% of Brazilian imports in 2021. Really? This are we talking about? Aren't we going to talk about the subsidies that are being dumped really in whatever areas that, governments consider strategic? Anyway, I'll stop here. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, Tatiana. What?
Right. Okay.
No, hang on. Vera, hang on.
Oh.
I'll give you the floor in a moment. Thank you very much, Tatiana. And I agree with you that talk about development does not necessarily imply protectionism. In fact, development may actually need a more liberal trade stance. And now I'm going to come to you, Vera, to give you the floor. And please, when you take the floor, think a little bit about a question I asked earlier on. Something that you also implied. Brazil, you say, has improved its business environment, and Simon hasn't quite captured that, you think. Does that mean that is associated with that is there now less concern in this improved business environment about possible exchange rate manipulation, which the business community used to be very concerned about? It's yours, Vera.
Clemens, to answer you, if you go to the numbers of license that was, I remember I talk about the opening economy, some law like this, to put bureaucracy down. And the numbers of paper that were skipped from the trade issue is huge. So this answer to you, they try to do. It's okay with the sound. Something is wrong here. Sound okay. Look, the bureaucracy, papers, red tapes, and all this. This was a movement to liberalize the trade on this issue. Let me go again to the missing element here in the discussion. Why now we are listening that Brazil is going to move more to Latin America countries and so on. One point that is missing is that somebody arrived in Latin America trade before us. That is China. China is again really eating all the trade space that we have here in Brazil. Is invading Argentina and all the Latin American countries. I have the numbers. So the space to Brazil exports has really diminished because of the way China moves inside the region. The big issue. So let's see how the new government is going to deal with this. On tariff, Vitor, I fully agree with you. The tariff Brazil is, they are awful. This is a point that, come on, you know me, and I spend all the time discussing this. And this goes to the Van den Bosch point. What is cost of Brazil, Professor? This is the way that you make the exchange of the private sector and the government. Don't put a hand on my tariff that protects me, and I'm not going to push you to make the reforms that you need to do. So this kind of agreement is as old as I am studying trade, right? And again, and what is the cost of Brazil? It's taxation, a huge amount of taxation. And Hamid, this is for you also for service. The amount of taxation on service in Brazil is the element that explains why Brazil is not evolving on the export on this. It's impossible to export a service in Brazil. Again, Brazil, the government has to do something on this. What is the cost of employment is huge in Brazil. Huge bureaucracy and all the pensions, and so the way the pension is spread and so on. Come on, pension fund is a problem all around the world. And then you put bureaucracy, as I told you, the license, all the paper that you have to fill up to export and imports and so on. Well, they try to diminish this, and I have the numbers. So that the paper that's cutting out is not enough. It is perhaps not enough. So how to deal with the cost of this kind of agreement between the private sector and the government? Sorry, Professor Van den Bosch, it's not WTO that's going to solve it. But it's awful to say. It's again a thing that I hope the new government will maintain. It's the core issue of OECD. That's regulatory burden. The way, logistic, the cost of logistics, and how you see, because you compare the countries and the grades of Brazil are awful. They indicate, so you push the government to say, look, if you want, it's a regulatory policy. That's the point of Brazil. It's awful, the regulatory policy of Brazil. The way you make new laws, the politicians, and without any kind of cost-benefit analysis, everything. So again, it's not WTO issue, but it's related to. On exchange rate, it's funny. All the big currencies are going down against the dollar. The dollar is it's a sovereign again. Everybody's buying dollar. Guess what's going on Brazil? Because we have this the basic rate going up because of inflation. Guess what's going on? The dollar is going down in Brazil. Come on, it's amazing. Because the international funds are putting money on Brazil again. And it's amazing what's happened with after the election day on Monday, it's amazing what's going on, completely against all the odds. The issue of exchange rate, again, it depends on what the new government is going to do. That is, if they are going to use the devaluated currency to import, invite new importers or not. And so this is an issue that is being discussed in the academics also. On aircraft, I think I bet that the maintenance, because of the power of Embraer, the big firm in Brazil, so aircraft, yes. Now, if I am old enough, I remember very well the role of government procurement. And this, for all people, they know how the government procurement can be used an instrument for development of Brazilian firms. So this is a thing that I will not bet my money on this. Trading service, Hamid, yes, it's amazing how it's different. The numbers that Simon present, and again, the numbers I have, it's amazing. So I have to see. In the area of internet on digital trade, I'm following what's going on. Brazil is exporting service. There's many firms that are exporting and so on. And I fully agree. 60% of the value added in goods came from service. And I think that things change. But again, the problem of Brazil is the burden of taxation on service. Hamid, it's crazy, completely. So the big issue of Brazil, the big issue on the cost of Brazil is taxation. You know that we have federal taxes on taxation on state taxes and other rates, and you have the municipal. It's a mess, really. This is the point that it's so difficult to pinpoint. And to Clemens, to say, Clemens, despite my disagreements with Simon, I'm still a person that believes that that trade liberalization can help a lot, and imports can. The excuse of Brazil not cutting tariff is again internal pressure, and also the problem of Mercosur. And this is the thing that you have to do. The last government really put Mercosur on spot, but I think now that Latin America will be a priority, and so Mercosur, the position of Brazil will be much more, how you say that, more friendly, keeping and waiting for Argentina to have a bigger space to breathe a little bit. And see how they are going to solve the crisis over there. So really, it was a pleasure, Clemens, to be here.
Thank you very much.
Victor, you raise your hands.
Thank you very much. Victor, do you have perhaps a word or two to say on, in particular, the leadership role of Brazil with developing countries?
I bet so. Let me give you a hint. Reading the newspapers of today, Elio, this is for you also. You have new names for the ministry. Just gossips from the newspapers that Mercadante could be the economic coordinator of the program. Lula could be the Minister of Foreign Affairs. Master Amorim will be the personal envoy of the new president. That a place that was represented by Professor. We had this kind of model before, Marco Aurelio. And then the speculation that you have also that who's going in the economic side, no names of technicians, but names from an important thing for you. Lula was elected by a coalition, and this is important. Lula was elected by a coalition, and the most important point is the figure of the
Alchemy.
Alchemy. Alchemy was from the party of Fernando Henrique. He's an old guy of the party, and against the main supporters of Lula, the PT, Amorim is playing a big role. And it's true that he assembled a lot of votes for Lula. And the other point that is important, economists, important economists that work in the Fernando Henrique Cardoso support Lula. And what we speculate at this is not only for democracy, but it's also for please don't put your government in the center of the spectrum. So this
Vera, we're running out of time, and I want to give the floor to one or two others. Victor, a final word?
On the last gossip.
Thank you, Vera. Thank you. Victor, do you have a moment?
Yeah, thank you very much, Clem. On your question about leadership of developing countries, leadership is not something that you claim for yourself. It's something that requires a lot of thought, a lot of input, action, a lot of work, a lot of action, and that you're recognized by others. You don't claim yourself to be a leader if others are not led by you. So this is something that is trickier than it seems. So is Brazil going to align itself with other large developing countries in this sort of S&D discussion? Let's see. As Vera was saying, there might be a more centrist view now, but let's wait and see, and let's put this into a certain perspective as well. What I really wanted to say is that the international environment today, and I think this discussion is a good one, and the TPR of Brazil could be an interesting time to discuss what the international environment is and how does it reflect to countries like Brazil. Measures on steel and aluminum that are important for several large developing countries, and the measures that the US took during the Trump years and have not been lifted, subsidization in semiconductors, electric cars, the whole of the environmental issue, to use it as maybe I wouldn't say protectionist, but with a protectionist effect, industrial policy, strategic autonomy in the European Union, the whole issue of what is the government's role in the economy. Tatiana mentioned Brazil comes late to the party. This is something that, unfortunately, you have to understand the international setting and the influence it might have in the narrative internally in the countries. So this is very important, not only for Brazil, but I would claim for this whole group that we discuss the issue in a broader way, which is not trivial. It's really not a trivial discussion. Thanks, Claire.
Thank you. I agree, Victor. Thank you very much. I'm going to go in the following order now. I'm going to go brief to Simon, then wrap up our discussion with Tatiana, and then ask Lou to close the meeting. Simon? Perhaps a word as well on transparency here.
Yes. So thank you, Clem, and to bring us back to the purpose of talking about this in the context of the Brazil TPR. I mean, I'll react in the following way. So if I were a delegate, I would want to ask Brazil, why is it that in 2017 Brazil imported $66 billion of commercial services, and in 2021, the last year, the data is available from the WTO, they imported 48 billion. So I think Hamid's question about what's going on the service side is a very good one, because it looks like foreign firms are having a very difficult time selling services into the Brazilian market, and it would be useful to understand why. Secondly, with respect to the Brazil cost, this received a lot of attention in the last TPR and was pointed out by many. I think good points have been made about the complexity of the tax system and the uncertainty of it. The only additional point I would want to understand is perhaps one of the reasons why Brazil feels the need to hand out so many subsidies to firms is precisely because the tax burden is so high. So maybe there's an interlinkage between these two. And with respect to the transparency of Brazilian policy, if you actually look at the amount of information that's available compared to how much it trades, Brazil does actually rather well. But that does not mean that the strategy of the Brazilian government appears to be either coherent. I think Tatiana's had some doubts in this respect, and nor does it seem that anyone is actually aggregating up all of the different measures to try and see what the overall picture is. Instead, you get these snapshots, which is why I think some of the discussion today has gone in different directions. And lastly, on digital trade, I mean, here, if people have want a sort of update on that, I have colleagues who track this for Brazil, and I have some slides I can share with Matt as well. So thank you, Clem, for the opportunity to contribute.
Simon, thank you very much for your contribution. And on services, perhaps localization, Hamid, might be a problem. Tatiana, the final word is with you, and then I'm going to go to Lou.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to echo Victor's words. I think we need to be mindful of the international setting and how that will influence Brazil's trade policy in the future. I have a sense that we will see this connection coming up quite clearly. If you ask me what are the issue areas that I would look for in potential changes in the WTO because of a new administration, and I would look at intellectual property, GPA development, and SDT environment. I think Brazil would be keen to take a more active position in that area. I know that Brazil is not part of the structured discussions, but I see Brazil being more active on that. At the same time, I think I would agree with Vera and Victor here. It remains to be seen how this different narrative will translate into concrete changes in this policy areas, in this issue areas. I think the development and Brazil's role in the developing world is something that may see some changes. And I agree with Victor, leadership is something that you earn, you don't claim, right? And it takes time for Brazil to rebuild its credibility in the developing world, to be frank, in the WTO for what's happened in the past few years. But I will keep an eye on that for sure. Having said that, I see room for moderate positions in that regard, but I also see Brazil trying to reconnect itself, replug itself and in the developing world in ways that we didn't see in the past few years. I'll stop here. Thank you so much. It's been really a pleasure.
Tatiana, thank you very much, and thank all of you very much for what I think has been a rather good discussion, at least interesting discussion. Lou, we're out of time. Would you care to close us?
Yeah, no, thanks, Clem. Just to compliment on what you said, I think what also Victor has pointed out is that this exercise probably does something better than previous one, because we're talking beyond Brazil. We're talking about international context.
And we're talking about the system, Lou, in part.
Yeah, about the system. So which means that what Victor said, that what we are trying to do here is not trivial. So I think I like that very much. Thanks very much to you, Clem, for your leadership on this. I just want to conclude by passing one message, which I did in the previous session, that our group, FMG, Friends of Multilateralism, is now 6 years old. So we are undergoing, starting a kind of what we call strategic review of what we have done in the past 6 years and what we should do and how we can better do to serve the increase of the system and also the members. So we would welcome any ideas, any comments, any suggestions from all of you, delegations, ambassadors, professors, and also our own members, of course, and also think tanks from other places. So anything you could share with us, passing us a message to me, to our members, to my sister Lenny, who is here. So that will be very much helpful for us to probably mature a little bit and graduate from primary school after 6 years, from kindergarten after 6 years to primary school, so we could better serve you all. So with that, I thank you all and looking forward to see you next time.
Thank you. The meeting is closed.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.